Thanks, Patty.
All right, welcome everybody. Let's get started. Good evening. I am Dr. Rachel Wagner, Professor of Philosophy and Religion and the incoming coordinator of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Ithaca College. Welcome to this F2F Salon. F2F is a partnership between Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, directed by Dr. Patricia Zimmerman. Tonight's event has additional co-sponsorship from the World Literatures, Language, and Cultures Department and the Center for LGBT Education, Outreach, and Services at Ithaca College. Thank you to Dr. Michael Richardson and Luca Marr for their support. Tonight's event moves F2F into a new format of engaged conversation and a new domain with a more national audience beyond Ithaca College. So our format for this evening will be an introduction of our speakers, a 35-minute conversation between our speakers, 20 minutes of audience Q&A where we ask you to come on camera and ask live questions rather than in chat. And after that, there'll be 5 minutes of takeaways from tonight's featured scholars. So from 8 to 8:15 p.m., we invite you to a Zoom after hours party for informal conversation and celebration. F2F first took shape at the beginning of the pandemic through the imagination and devotion of faculty members from different departments with intersecting interests who wanted to create more opportunities to learn about one another's scholarship, especially areas relating to feminist gender and sexuality studies. The name F2F was chosen because of its fruitful range of possible meanings, including faculty to faculty, feminist to feminist, field to field, festival to festival, friend to friend, and hopefully eventually face to face. There have now been a number of F2F events with plans for many more. We're so fortunate you have chosen to join us as a friend and a feminist for a fabulous forum flared with foresight and fantastic frankness. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Carla Golden, recently retired from the psychology department at Ithaca College after a 37-year career as a developmental feminist psychologist. Carla's scholarly work focuses on psychoanalytic feminism and women's sexual identities. Carla served as coordinator of the Women's and Gender Studies program for 7 years. She prompted, drove, and nourished the work that resulted in our new Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies major. We're so happy to have her here with us tonight. I now turn things over to Carla, who will introduce our participants in tonight's conversation.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome and introduce our two speakers, as I've been looking forward to this evening from the moment it was first conceptualized as an F2F event. My introductions will necessarily be brief, as I know we're all eager to listen in on the conversation that we are about to hear. Dr. Matt Fournier is Assistant Professor of French in the Department of World Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at Ithaca College. He is also affiliated faculty in the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. Educated in France, Matt received his PhD in 2014 in comparative literature from a prominent French university, whose name I shall put in the chat after my introduction. Dr. Fournier's areas of expertise include French 20th century literature, European modernism, transgender studies, queer theory, political theory, and continental philosophy. His driving interest is in political theory and its articulation with and through trans studies. His articles have been published in Journal of Postcolonial Writing, Simone de Beauvoir Studies, the Transgender Studies Quarterly, as well as in a number of French journals, which is to say that he's well published in both French and English. But here I'll cite just one example of his very significant book chapters, because it's in a groundbreaking volume forthcoming this spring from Bloomsbury Press, which also contains a contribution from our other speaker this evening, Dr. Abraham Weil. The volume is Deleuze, Guattari, and the Schizoanalysis of Trans Studies, and Matt's chapter is titled How the Gender Binary Was Never Supposed to Work. His current book project is titled Dysphoric Assemblage, Writing Gender in the Interwar Years, in which he uses French modernist literature to understand the emergence of modern gender, to expand on the gap between political theory and trans studies, and to argue that the gender binary is inherently dysphoric. Dr. Abraham Weil is assistant professor in the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Cal State University Long Beach. He holds a PhD in Gender and Women's Studies, which he received in 2018 from the University of Arizona. His areas of expertise include Black studies, trans studies, feminist theory, sexuality studies, and continental philosophy, with a focus on the work of French theorists Deleuze and Guattari. His articles have been published in the Transgender Studies Quarterly, Journal of Theoretical Humanities, Studies in Gender and Sexuality, and Abolition, a Journal of Insurgent Politics. In addition to many other chapters and reviews he's authored, he too will have a chapter in the aforementioned book on the schizoanalysis of trans studies. His chapter is titled Transmolecular Revolution. His current book project is an elaboration of that article titled Transmolecular Revolution, Transversality and the Mattering of Political Life. It draws on the work of Deleuze and Guattari to theorize about radical political formations, anti-Black racism, trans embodiment, and continental philosophy in the US and France from the 1960s to the present. Dr. Weil is also currently working on 2 textbooks focused on feminist and transgender theory. I could say so much more about each of these 2 trailblazing scholars, but instead I extend my warmest welcome to Drs. Fournier and Weil. And without further ado, I turn the program over to you.
Hi, thank you all for being there, and thank you, Carla, for this very kind introduction. So let's begin this. So first, my first remark and question, I've been following this series since 1 year now, and we are the first guests who identify as male or use male pronouns. Yet, I think we both are also, would also say that we are feminists. So Abe, how do you relate to that? What kind of a feminist are you?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and to everybody at Ithaca who's been super communicative and helpful and thorough. I really appreciate it. I'm super honored to be in touch with Matt's work in general, but really feel lucky to talk about it with him. I think some of the questions that we'll be taking on today are ones that deeply plague me, so to speak. But the first one being no exception, right? What kind of feminist am I? I love loaded questions, and I think this is one of them. I would say that this at least has 2 answers, probably more. Certainly on one hand, we could recite any number of tensions with feminism, ways that it's been unhelpful or even harmful to my own sort of being or becoming. But I think more often it goes another way. So I'll sort of pass the puck on the negative side to something that Matt says in his article that's kind of formed this discussion, which is just that my relationship is also riddled with paradoxes and alliances that are at times strange or queer, and a lot of unanswered questions. But one of the ways I've been thinking about feminism lately is actually sort of through a renewed investment after Sarah Ahmed's Living a Feminist Life, where she sort of gives us an easy out to say, our feminist biographies often integrate or push against other parts of our biographies, and that at some sense we just have a kind of understanding of ourselves as feminists all along, right? So I'd say more specifically, and then I would love to hear your sort of take on it. I've recently found myself doing a bit of writing, a compelled kind of writing. So not necessarily like my own writing, but something akin to like a diversity statement, if you could imagine that. And I found myself deeply irritated by it, just really kind of having a fit about needing to make an argument that I do this kind of labor or work, right? And I kind of returned to this thing that Ahmed talks about in Living a Feminist Life around the kind of diversity work that we are often compelled to do, and to think about the ways that, from a very early age, and again, to sort of bring into Matt's article that we're thinking of today, trans ontologies, with the play on words toward ant as opposed to aunt, right? That, around my youth, right, when sort of diversity terms started getting leveraged at me, right, they ranged from, lesbian to butch, dyke, Black, Jewish, disabled, fat, slutty, these kinds of things that were really about policing my body, policing my sort of subjectivity, that really produced this kind of minority bingo where you have to have some sort of framework, so to speak, to use the words of a friend, the framework makes the brain work or something like this, so using feminism as a kind of framework, I think, is really how I best relate to it, right? So that it's easily a kind of thing that can fall into, and to talk to you, Matt, right, some of the things that Eve Sedgwick says around kind of a paranoia or a hermeneutics of suspicion that can emerge when one is working kind of from this reflexive space, right? And I think later I've sort of would say I've shifted, right, more to the kind of way of thinking about feminism as something that performs a necessarily political task for me, and that one that gives me, to use Matt's words, right, a way out, or a way towards something else. So
yes, I think, yeah. Thank you. I think there's a lot to say about that. I think Sarah Ahmed's book, Living a Feminist Life, also had a very good influence on me, a great influence, because when I started, actually, when I came teaching at Ithaca College, I came at the last minute, and so I had to teach a class that was already scheduled, that was called Women in French Society, and I didn't feel at all prepared for that, because I had just I was in the midst of transitioning, and I was already passing, and I had taken my distance from feminism, and also in the sense that I didn't feel that it was my place to be a feminist, and that also my research had been mostly addressing questions of masculinity, and I had been thinking about masculinity. And when I started teaching this class, it was, I think, a couple of years before the Trump presidency and election. So students taking this class weren't really, they weren't really attuned to feminism, and mostly the question that I asked at the beginning of class about feminism got answers such as, well, feminism was really useful for my grandmother, but now we're good. And this isn't something you would hear today in the classroom. But at this time, I found myself, because really I didn't have the expertise to teach about women, and I didn't know how to teach about women without teaching about feminism, I found myself lecturing a group of students who mostly identified as female about the necessity of feminism. And I was thinking, what are you doing? I was thinking about the paradox. And it took me some time and some reading and some also coming to terms with my own masculinity or not masculinity, to go back to feminism and to start thinking about feminism and seeing myself as a feminist. And Living Sarah Ahmed has been really influential, because the type of things she talks in Living a Feminist Life, for instance, is all this labor that we find ourselves doing, and yet as scholars, for instance, or as teachers. And yet, when I was thinking about it today, and I don't know, I want to hear what you think about that. I love doing this labor. I love addressing trans issues with students, and this is something that we have to argue against in a way. But this is also a part of my job that comes with a lot of positive effects. So what do you think about that? How do you feel about that?
It's a good question. I mean, yeah, I think anybody who knows me will say that I tend to have a very critical perspective of work in general. I'm not somebody who likes to work. Certainly, I do not love to work. And I take that from kind of Audre Lorde's question, how often do we really love our work? But what I think you are pointing to, right, is that there's something in the thinking, in the project of thinking, that allows for different kinds of ways of living. And for those of us who are working on our bodies, or at the side of our bodies, or at the surface or pores of our bodies, that this is, in a sense, sort of life forming at the same time that it is work, right? And I think, I don't know that I would go so far as to say that I love it, but one of the ways that I approach our conversations, for instance, are to think about what it means to make meaning within philosophy, right? Because this has been a long sort of debated philosophical question. Is life meaningless? Is there meaning? What are we carving out here, right? And I think your use of Simone de Beauvoir, right, gets us to that question pretty quickly, right? To think about, or for instance, something that I was reading, refreshing on Dr. Golden's sort of reading of gender, right, as the thing that kind of launches us into thinking about social construction and really gives us a bounds to rethink our investments, right? So all of those things, I would say, have positive outlets, positive affects that emerge from them. But I think one of the things I'm very concerned about within trans studies, and certainly within other kinds of diversity disciplines, is the mandate that's being put on by institutions to do this kind of work without changing the rubric of how we do it, right? So we're being asked to love our work
Yes.
in a place that fundamentally doesn't always love us back, right?
Yes. No, absolutely. And I think, yeah, this leads me also to a question about trans studies and what it is we do in trans studies, because like you said, there are institutions warning us to, or assuming that we will be doing this labor. But there's also the fact that trans studies are often perceived as only a sociological, in the broader sense of the term, as a sociological field that does justice to trans people, which of course we want to do, but it also goes much further than that. And there's also, to me, there's also the big questions are, I don't believe that trans studies are made to be about and for trans people. Yeah. What's your take on that?
Gosh, yeah, another loaded question. Yeah, so in thinking about this, I recently read Marquise Bay's The Problem of the Negro as a Problem for Gender. And I was really returned to this question that W. Du Bois asks, right? Which is, how does it feel to be the problem, or how does it feel to be a problem? Yes. And I think, trans studies, as it emerges in these kinds of spaces out of sexology, right, out of medicalization, psychology, these different sites that are not trans studies itself, but rather the kinds of vexing fields that have come to speak on trans life, I think it gets to this kind of way that transness is not, and in my own work, right, I think about this with transness and Blackness, and something that Bay says is that it's not allowed in a space to just exist, right? It has to be a problem. It has to be something that we bring forward. And so similarly to, I think, what the relationship is between, say, feminist theory and something like woman, the category of woman, right? We're constantly indexing in asking the kinds of questions that we're asking. We're always already indexing that there's a problem, right? It's in some ways concedes to the idea that we have something to fix and get riled up about, right? So I think that that's a hard position to be in the face of people whose work is not that, right? It's different kinds of labor there, right?
Absolutely. As Ahmed would say, we sometimes also become the problem, even in trans studies. And I think my position, it's the same ambiguity that I had with the article you mentioned about feminism and Simone de Beauvoir, because my own position in feminism is very ambiguous because it's tainted with dysphoria. The idea that I've always learned about feminism through Beauvoir as in the form of women as a category of oppression. And of course, when I discovered that as a dysphoric teenager, it made total sense to me that one wouldn't want to become a woman. But because I didn't want to and couldn't. And so after all these years, and now that I'm in the position of a man and I have to deal with the privilege of white masculinity, I have revisited my question on my vision of Beauvoir as what does it mean to think about women as a category of oppression? And knowing that my position is never going to be clear because I'll never going to be able to know which part of me is dysphoria and which part of me is analysis. But I still think that Beauvoir's idea of women as category of oppression is something very productive, that because she has these overarching views that goes way beyond gender. And I think going to Beauvoir was also something that connected me more to what I want to do in trans studies, because my work in trans studies started with queer theory, because that's what I knew in France and that's all I knew. And then I've become, I more and more realize how trans studies in a way strangely has let go of bodies. Queer theory, sorry. I meant queer theory has let go of bodies, and trans studies are a way to put that back in the picture. And as also Bay is saying, there's also the question of race and the question of revolution, really. And so I think that we should assert the revolutionary power of trans studies. But
yeah, well, let me ask you, because I think this is kind of a crucial point that a lot of people are having trouble sorting out, right? This distinction between queer and trans studies. And I think it's kind of a provocation to say that it's the body that's kind of the site of disagreement, right? So two questions maybe that are sort of related. The first is to kind of remind folks of a GLQ article by Susan Stryker, queer transgender studies, queer studies evil twin, right? Wherein she sort of argues that we have the same parentage, right? Our sort of feminism, sexuality, these kinds of questions are parenting these disciplines in the same ways. And yet trans studies is sort of imagined as the cannibal, you know, of its twin, queer studies. And these ways that in some ways are trying to pick up like the vision of queer in the 90s, right? That it's like the anti-identity that's moving forward, moving away from these kinds of demarcations as unfixed, unmoving, unchanging. But that, you know, at that point, I don't know if people remember, right? But like a lot of straight people became queer, right? A lot of left people became queer. It became sort of a rubric to move away from sexuality and its practice and more a way of kind of aligning kinship, family type language that we were sort of using at the time, right? And I think when trans studies launches out of that, it's recalibrating because there's a certain attention to the body that even as we abstract the body, create analytics out of transness, we're, as far as we want to abstract the body, we're tied to it, right?
yes.
In very material ways that, in my estimation, do bring us back to that kind of materialist feminist question that so often then gets rolled into turf kind of ideologies or something like this. It makes me want to rescue it a little bit, right? So part of what you're doing in your work is kind of rescuing this question of materialism that for those of us whose bodies are being targeted, right? And this kind of very geopolitical targeting kind of way, both from inside feminism and outside feminism, right? How then do we sort of, shake out the differences between queer and trans studies? Do we want to hold clear lines? Do you see ways that those two projects are always already working together, or are there parts where they're working apart?
Yeah, I think that, first of all, the question of tough feminism, trans-exclusionary feminism, if anybody can ignore them, is really problematic because they are killing the conversation in a way. And so it's really hard to, for example, in the case of Beauvoir, it's really easy to have her have her potentially align with what's one side of the other, but mostly the trans feminist argument seems to me extremely just ridiculous and not even worth following. But every time we tend to argue certain things, we are brought back to it. So about queer studies, I also think that there's a question of what gets me more, the aspect of queer studies that is the most interesting for me is the question related to norms. So for instance, my foundational text would be Michael Warner and In Fear of a Queer Planet, for instance. Even, the trouble with normal to certain ways. And this idea of what do we make of norms? And this also brings us back to continental philosophy and Foucault, who is mostly characterized as in American queer theory as this big anti-normative guy, when most of his work is about norms and what we make of them and how we make them and how we need them and how we navigate them. And I think the interesting aspect of queer theory, even in, if we go back to Gender Trouble, for instance, and Butler, it's about norms and questions on the normative. And I think this is still actual. What I believe has been lost in queer theory is also the question of, I'm not going to call it, I know it's a loaded word as well, but intersectionality at least. All these foundational texts of queer theory, they're extremely white. They're also written by people who speak from a privileged place and who advocate for certain things that are only available and doable, or certain practices that are only available and doable for people speaking from a certain position of privilege. And I think trans studies has also the power to reorient that, or to almost, I was about to say, to find something that was there but has been lost, or to reconnect with a potential of advocating for instability. And also maybe it's what you call transversality, and we're going to go talk about that later, but to move us to recapture something that was at work in queer theory that could lead us to a place of thinking towards beyond binaries and beyond capitalism, because we are also after that.
Yeah, there's something in what you said sort of reminds me of Roderick Ferguson's treatment of queer, right? Thinking about this idea that we learn everything we need to know about queer studies from like our grandmother's porch, like the sort of bounds of difference, the bounds of language, the bounds of our bodies, right? That they all sort of shake out in these unauthorized places. And so when we have something like a canon of queer theory, we're often talking about, or at least in my experience, my students are currently revolting against Foucault, right? This is a full stage revolt. We're not citing him anymore. And I take their meaning, right, to be, I'm sick of citing the same idea of Foucault's when there really are all these other places I actually learn this. And I think that that's valuable, right? It's a valuable critique. At the same time, the dude said a lot of stuff, primarily because he had a really privileged upbringing, was highly educated, and had the space to do it. And also the capacity, right, to move about Europe and be queer and be into BDSM and be with trans people, right? Like not everybody had that. So it's a sort of paradox of our disciplines when we're trying to think and link with these ideas that are in some ways stale to newcomers, right? Are also sort of being constantly revented, constantly rehashed. And I think Foucault's a great example of somebody who's a mainstay, not because he's our only authorizing text, but he is talking about race, sexuality, class, things that sort of predate in the scholarship of the time, right? For philosophy, he was making major sort of shifts and turns. And so to sort of get to, contemporary work, I got into a lot of my own questions when I went to graduate school. And I went originally to work with Elizabeth Gross, who, if you do not know, is a sort of feminist philosopher, and probably one of our greatest living readers of philosophy and feminist from a feminist perspective in certain ways, right? But one always has the sense when you run into somebody really smart that they have an indexing point that's impossible for them to get over, right? And for her, right, it's been trans. And so I went into work with Liz Gross and Jasper Poor at Rutgers Gender Studies as a graduate student, right? And soon was sort of faced with what Liz's position on transness. I think that I provided a quote that could be shared, but basically, right, the Cliff Notes version, however queer you are, however trans you are, identifying as you are a man or a woman, you come from a man or a woman, and it's a hardcore sexual difference argument that, in my mind, to my mind, actually voids and violates the rest of her philosophy. So I think when I come to these questions, I'm coming from the side of paradox, right? And from the side of being like a Black trans person who's been told that they should, kick off my whole life, right? And so sort of as you open your article, that the body is being pulled in all of these directions, to me, it's like these questions around trans studies and queer studies, the different questions that trans studies are asking is like, what does it mean to be pulled apart into different directions, right? I'm not looking for a homogenous experience. I'm looking to tear apart, right? I'm looking to divorce from this body, from parts of this body, without ever losing this body, right? Because of this body, it's an investment in my body, not a deterritorialization from, but rather a sort of investment in, right? And I think that those sorts of questions, when you're talking philosophically, really get us to a different starting place than something like what happens to non-normativity at the site of normativity, right?
And no, I think you're absolutely right there. And I think that the challenge and the most exciting things about trans studies is bringing what you said, bring the body in the middle, and bring the body with the question of normativity. And I also think this has a potential to teach us a few stuff about also the questions of that would pertain to environmental studies, like how do we relate to the world? How do we relate to the world? How do we relate to this thing that's called or not called nature? And how do we inhabit the world? And I'm also very interested in the potential of trans studies regarding environmental studies, and the conflict, of course, that comes to mind, because many people are interested in the environment, are really uncritical of the gender binary, and so I think, and have these very conservative visions of gender. And could you say more about transversality?
Always.
And let's talk a bit about our favorite philosopher ever, Deleuze and Guattari, if you have a couple of more minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. Always happy to talk about transversality. It's a concept that I've really sort of grafted to in the last maybe, I don't know, 7 years or so, right? That has really helped me to sort of think in curves, I think is the easiest way to say it at first pass. So, For those completely unfamiliar, this is a term that is predominantly coming out of Guattari's pen, right? Deleuze does a lot of the philosophical molding of the concept in their joint work. So in A Thousand Plateaus or in interviews or in Anti-Oedipus, it does show up and you can really hear Deleuze's kind of crafting within it, right? But importantly, in Guattari's writing alone, he writes about it in a very material function. So for those of you who don't have any history on Guattari, he's begins as an analyst. He's trained by Jacques Lacan, who is often seen as his kind of antithesis, right? So we often forget when we're thinking about these two thinkers that one is the analyst of the other. And if you've ever had an analyst, you know how that relationship works out, right? So thinking of it from there, it's a very material function to think about the ways that, in particular, the psychiatric clinic that he's working at in the 60s, Laborde, which is about 60 miles outside of Paris, that during this time, they're really trying to work out what to do with people who are presenting as problems to society, right? So to sort of really get into kind of the psychoanalytic moment, the turn towards crisis, towards confinement, towards what Foucault will say, like going inside, right? Putting inside the clinic, the birth of the clinic itself. Guattari is trying to figure out how we reorder it so as to not have these kinds of power dynamics. And he uses transversality in particular. And so the kind of scholarly, version of that is that it's a tool that helps us think about how to interrupt or relate from an affective point of view, how to auto-produce, how to adapt, how to transverse kinds of power. It looks to interrupt anything that's like a totalizing logic, right? So to break apart. And so instead of saying all that is X is Y, all that is X is anything, right? So as I sort of use this in my own work, working out the tensions between Blackness and transness are not easy. And they are ones that I think without a commitment to understanding the relationship between Blackness and transness, both fields suffer for it, right? And so one of the things that I really think it's useful for is really just thinking across texts. So one text I'd like to plug, and then I want to hear from Matt on your answer to the same question, is the recent essay by Nat Baldino in TSQ's 8.3, don't hold me to that, I can get it to you. It's called Living in the Skin of a Theory. And in it, he's really sort of, they're talking about the ways that incrementability in trans studies has been really hard to overcome, and that we need a more generous practice of grabbing objects, of having discussions, of making lateral connections, making horizontal sort of structures of thought, so that we can really kind of get out of some of these voided and voiding positions that are so, to get back to the very first question, par and parcel with the history of feminism, right? So how do we interrupt those? I think it's number one function for me. But what about you? What do you think? Where are we going? How do we get there?
I think the idea of the fact that we need to talk about these appropriate objects. It's really interesting, and it's also why I love and use a lot the work of Deleuze and Guattari, because they see philosophy as a tool and concepts as a way of making tools. And I think trans studies could also be a tool, which or a set of tools to look at the world, to look at societies, to look at self, to look at the environment even. And I think sometimes when we say that, we're also received as not being supportive enough of the community and taking things too lightly, because I'm using, in my own research and my own writing, I'm using the concept, I'm using dysphoria as a concept and as a tool, which doesn't mean at all that it's not true, that it's not real, that I do feel it and live with it, but I still think dysphoria is a good entry point to think about gender, because my idea is that dysphoria is a consequence of gender. And but I'm using a lot the work of Deleuze and Guattari, not directly, because to be entirely clear, what they said about gender is mostly not very interesting, and they're really not feminists, or well, no, let's say they weren't. And but what I think is really interesting is their approach. I mean, the most important thing about Deleuze and Guattari is their critique of capitalism. Their critique of capitalism and their use of psychoanalysis, because they managed to get psychoanalysis rid of all the narratives and the scenario that Freud and Lacan put it there. So mommy, daddy, or the name of the father and the phallus. And no, there's nothing and a crowd of desires, pulsions, drives, hungers, and what they call assemblages or agencement in French, which is how things work together. So there is always a stability, but the stability is always contingent, and stability is created by moving things. And I think looking at gender in this way is really productive, because it holds into account at the same time the reality or the truth of it and the stability, but also the fluidity and the contingency.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I just shared a quote in the chat that I think kind of is part of the article, but where you're talking about dysphoria, that I think is really useful, right? Because you really ask a bigger question than I maybe really even read the first time I read through it. But this, how do we differentiate between internalized misogyny and gender dysphoria, I think is a really important sort of indexing point, right? Like that really helps us to kind of put out the stakes. And to get to Beauvoir, right, it is how we can understand ourselves as both subjects and objects, right? That this critical distinction she makes, that we are not just objects acted upon, we are subjects and objects at the same time. How do we parse that out? I think some of the questions might be in this thing that you said here. So I like it.
Yeah. And that's a great place when you said some of this might be in the questions. We're going to move to the Q&A with our wonderful audience. It's a very large audience tonight and a very heterogeneous one. So we'll have time now for Q&A and comments. We kindly ask, if you have a comment or question, that you raise your digital hand, and then we'll ask you to turn on your camera and we'll pull you into the screen via Spotlight. So we invite anybody and everyone to please join us here and continue this really stimulating dialogue. And while we're waiting for people, I'm going to ask a question, okay? And it's, I want to go right back to the title of this session, Transmasculinity and Feminism. And I wanted to ask you both to do two things with it. Abraham, you said we need to break apart. You said this about 4 or 5 times. How can we break apart transmasculinity and feminism? And Matt, I'm going to ask you to share with us your ideas about this idea, the assemblage from Deleuze and Guattari. Is there an assemblage or an assemblage between transmasculinity and feminism? I want to bring it back to the title of our session tonight. So Abraham, might you go first? And again, I'd like to encourage our participants to pop your digital hand up and we'll get you into the convo. I'm going to ask Abraham and Matt, I'm going to be doctrinaire and give you only 1 minute each.
I hate answering questions in 1 minute. Okay, I will say to the question, how do we break it apart? I mean, in a sense, right, like I find myself doing this all of the time. You don't live in this body for this long and not figure out how to break out of it. You know, it's kind of the basic premise is that I listened to this kind of poem in my head as a refrain by Ursa Daly Ward. It says, I know where joy comes from and how to make it. Right. So I think at one level, when you are as minoritized as I have been in my life, in my body, and I trust came out of the womb very gay. This was never a question of would I be different, just in which ways. I think one finds from that position of corneredness, an exuberance, a jouissance in the sort of living of life, of using parts of different ideas and bringing them together. So in a sense, to pass it to Matt, right, think in assemblages. I am a point articulated of intensity on an assemblage. I continue to re-articulate where that point is going or is, and it's touched by the sort of intensities that I come into contact with, both materially and affectively. Close to 1 minute.
Exactly 1 minute. Bravo. Matt, 1 minute.
So I think if I can think about transmasculinity and feminism in terms of an assemblage, it works well because as an assemblage, it works and doesn't work. So there's point of tensions and things and desire that go together and don't go together. And so we can look at it in a certain temporality. If I'm looking at Beauvoir and her idea that woman is a category of oppression, of alienation, as she would say, then this category was taken upon by materialist feminists, and the French materialist feminists, with particularly Wittig and Mathieu, they were also radical lesbians. And their idea was, okay, if women is a category of oppression, we don't need a category of women and we don't need men. And the only way to end the oppression is just to take men out of the equation. And so sexuality in this case was a political choice. And so then we moved to, okay, I'm not going to be able to do this in 1 minute. So I'm
Okay, why don't you think about what the then is? And let me just say, if we can get some other people, other participants here on the screen, keep thinking about that then. And we do have a question here from Rachel Wagner. We'll bring her in. Keep thinking of your then and we'll go back to it, Matt. Rachel.
Well, this question was based on something that Matt said, but Abraham, feel free to respond if you want to as well. Matt, you said you talked about moving beyond binaries and beyond capitalism. And I just wanted you to elaborate a little more on the connection between those two as you see it.
Well, I see gender as a category of oppression, or category of, as Foucault would say, subjectification. So it's one of the pieces that holds us together, such as, for instance, the divide between subject and object, for instance, or our also contemporary notion of science and fact versus fiction, for instance, white against black. It's also tied to the idea of the civilization, and it can be traced to the long 19th century, for instance, but it's also so. Going beyond binary thinking is also what gets us beyond, for instance, ideas of individuality. And what makes us, and this is also we could also have talked a lot about the problematic part played by identity politics, which is a good thing, and as long as it's a means to an end and then gets a trap. So I think the idea, it's also related to my idea about the environment and how we connect to it. As a capitalist society, we are useful as subjects, and as subjects we are divided from the world, from ourselves, from one another through screens, for instance, but we are divided in gender, and the binary is also means of controls. Of course, if we adopt the Foucauldian perspective or the Deleuzian perspective, there's no radical way out. There's what Deleuze calls lines of flight, for instance, points of rupture, ways to navigate that go to the border and change things. Don't know if this answers your question, but I think gender cannot be apprehended without thinking about capitalism.
Thank you.
And we have another question. Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Matt. That was really quite provocative. Allison, let's get you in here.
Yeah, we touched on it a little bit, but kind of the relationship between queer studies and trans studies. I didn't even know that there were different things. I thought that they were the same, or that there was, so hearing that they are in fact, two very different, strong communities, different things, and that there also may be not some animosity, but some differences between them. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, because this is brand new to me.
Abraham, how about you? Would you like to start? And then we'll toss it to Matt.
Sure, yeah. So yeah, I mean, a couple things, right? Like, they're obviously related. So I think in some sense, it's again to pull off of Strasser's language of parentage, right? I believe she says that both fields sort of emerge out of the union of feminism and sexuality studies, right? So we have those two as these kinds of proverbial shoulders of things that kind of come up and that they both sort of willfully kind of disrupt this narrative of the family, right? So this is where we get a lot of that kind of scholarship around queer failure, no future, this moment in kind of queer thinking. And I think in her article, she's also sort of going back to her essay, My Words to Victor Frankenstein, which if you haven't read, would be a really great sort of way to think about trans studies as a kind of different kind of set of questions. But it's to say that I think, the history of something like Judith Butler's gender trouble that emerges within queer theory as the kind of thing that is marking sexuality as this largely incoherent yet stable foundation for how we live our lives, right? Gets us to ask particular kinds of questions about behavior, about acts, right? Foucault's sexual act, sexual aim is another good resource for thinking about the distinction here. But that when we sort of emerge into kind of the beginnings of trans studies, which is often marked with Sandy Stone's The Empire Strikes Back, a post-transsexual manifesto, that this is actually a speech act. This is done as a conference paper that's interrupting the logics of queer studies and feminism of the time, so 80s. And if I could take you to a specific location, we're talking Santa Cruz's famous department,
History of Consciousness.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So the History of Consciousness department, where all of these sort of feminist thinkers are at the time, right? We have Sandoval, we have the sort of Ansel Dua goes through Haraway, right? All of these really important sort of critical moments. And what she's saying is she's responding to Janice Raymond's Transsexual Empire. And she's sort of saying, I've long sort of told this narrative of my life, but trans studies is now needing to tell a different narrative. We've been sharing these same kinds of stories. And so that's really where we see it kind of break into a separate discipline from an institutional perspective.
And
from a lived
we have
perspective,
another question coming up, and we have only 5 minutes left. So Matt, can I ask you to give us a quick 30 seconds, 1 minute on an answer to this question, or if you want to tease it out a little?
Well, the conflict, I think it also, there are actual conflicts, and there are also people working within the two disciplines. And the idea, the question and the tension revolves around the question that something has been called the realness of gender. Like, is gender real or not? And the idea that sometimes queer studies are getting too abstract, or are not taking bodies into account. And by bodies, that's the question of dysphoria. And there's also the question of gender as and gender transition as a legitimate need. That is something, and that's not the whole of trans studies, but there's a portion of trans studies that holds to the idea of gender as something almost innate and something we don't choose, which is blaming queer theory for not respecting that and for not respecting trans lives.
Excellent. 57 seconds. Bravo. Jennifer, let's pull you in here with your question.
Thank you so much. This has been fabulous. And I have to say, I guess I want to go back to one of the points that you were ending with, because when you introduced this idea that misogyny and gender dysphoria are two sides of the same coin in a sense, that just was this wonderful, mind-blowing moment for me. And so Matt, please send me a copy of this article. I want to read more. But also I'm really interested in hearing both of you talk about the implications of that, right? And you'll probably say it much better than I, but I'm trying to grapple, right? For me, there's no question, down with misogyny. And yet, Matt, you're also saying that gender dysphoria is on some level something to embrace this kind of in-between and to a space that one lives in, right? And so I don't know, how do you think about the implications of the connectedness of these concepts?
Well, thinking about that got me to think in terms of ethics, because I wasn't very interested in ethics. It wasn't a question I was asking myself, but then I'm thinking about, someone like the Spanish philosopher Preciado, who is arguing that transness and transmasculinity is a revolutionary move, which I cannot follow entirely. I would love for it to be. I would love for my transition to be revolutionary, but I find myself having white male privileges, which is like a currency. It's like having a green card or a European passport. It's worth a lot, and that's not going anywhere, and that doesn't depend on my mind frame. It's just how I'm perceived, and so I'm asking myself, there's no clean space where I would assess my own dysphoria, and where I would be in a position to be entirely devoid of frustration, and of the frustration that anyone who has been raised as a woman endures.
Good. And Abraham, we have less than a minute left, so do you have anything you'd like to add to Jennifer's question or Matt's comment?
Yeah, I'm going to share just a quote to maybe help along so that I don't have to say it all, but this is from that article I mentioned, Living in This Kind of Theory, in TSQ. I think that for me, there's an important misconception that should be kind of tossed over, that trans people like don't like being trans, or that we are sad that we're trans, right? Like that there's like this kind of misery inherent to the category. And I would say in my experience, trans people love being trans. Like it's one of the most exciting things that's ever happened to me personally, is being trans. And I really love the ways that it allows one to think. And so I think dysphoria as the other side of misogyny only works that way when we succumb to the understanding that you know, it's a bad position, right? So what Matt does in his article that I think is really great is he sort of says, I'm not talking about this medicalized dysphoria, this like you belong in the psychiatric ward. I'm talking about the thing that gave me enough instinct to say that I want to do it differently. And that if we all listen to that, right, if we all buffed the ways that misogyny works on all of us all the time, our psychic lives all the time, that we actually come out of it with a sort of a realm of possibilities, a capacity within the assemblage to do differently, to break apart. That's the 5th time. That was for you, Patty.
There you go, 5th time. And Jennifer, thank you for your question. And Matt and Abraham, thank you for these wonderful responses. There are other questions up, but we have to move to our takeaway and wrap it up. I'd like to ask the people who have their hands up to stay with everybody else for our informal after party, where we can continue to mine and explore these really important theoretical and political questions about transmasculinity and feminism. We're in the end of our session, and I'd like to ask both Matt and Abraham for some takeaways from this session. And I'd like to ask you to share with us, each of you, 3 words or concepts that we as participants and listeners, allies and comrades need in our toolbox. 3 words each. Okay, and if you want, you can do 1 word and ping pong off each other. Would that be better? Or you want to do all 3 at once?
No,
okay, so Matt, I'll give you the first word. What's a word that we need? As a way to take away, right? Can we give the audience a takeaway? Like you were both talking about tools, and I was thinking that might be a nice way to end. What tools do we need? What should we take away?
Delight. It's a word that I read in Marquis Bay, Dem Gun Rules the other day, and delight about being trans, because this answers to what Abe was just saying about we are absolutely delighted to be trans, and they are something that comes with the dysphoria, often also a delight in changing, in being different, in trying things, in being fluid, and in being read in different ways too. So delight would be my first word.
Great. Abraham, what's your first word? A tool or a word that people can leave with? party favor, if you will.
I'm gonna because delight's great. So I'm gonna build rather than select my own. So building off of delight, I would add Bay's use of problem, and in it he's sort of, you know, he's making 2 points. One, problems that we're looking to solve and problems that do not need to be solved. So those two. And I would suggest you read his first chapter of his Forerunner, his 2020 Forerunner text.
Yeah.
And Matt, word or tool number 2.
So, okay, I'll build on problems again. The idea and what Sarah Ahmed, Living a Feminist Life, which I really think that everybody working in academia and doing minority labors should read. And Ahmed said, when you talk about the problem, you become the problem.
Abraham, number 2.
I'm gonna go. I feel like I have to throw it in transversality. I would be remiss not to. For those of you looking for kind of quick reading on it, I might suggest. Well, I have a short piece on TSQ that would be the quickest of reading. But if you were wanting to read Guattari, I might suggest The Three Ecologies, or there is a collection called Transversality and Psychoanalysis that is a group of smaller readings that would work through it. Happy also to talk to anybody anytime about it.
And we can talk in the after party. Matt.
Okay, so let's
third concept, third word.
Assemblage in that case. Assemblage and the idea thinking about the assemblage is the idea thinking about what we are going through in terms of geography and not history, meaning thinking in terms of relationship. And I see somebody, Meredith, worked in the chat, delight in becoming versus delight in being. And we are only in relationship to others, ideas, places, and so on.
And Abraham, we're right at 8, so we need to be really short because everyone's waiting for the party. So last word, what's your third word?
My third, I'm going to go with erotics via Lord. And for those of you unfamiliar, I would suggest taking a listen. I personally like to listen. I try to a few times a week to uses of the erotic. There's a lot of YouTube links that are available. One of the things I think it's important to note, right? She's marking erotics as something that's resisting this notion of the pornographic, something that is deeply rooted and makes possible our knowing of our capacity for joy. So to get back to Matt's first word, delight, erotics help us to understand our capacity for joy and to demand them from our lives.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to be, in summary, the toolkit that we have been provided with what the conversation from Matt Fournier and Abraham Weil. Delight, problems, some more, transversality, assemblage, erotics, and joy. Go forth, break the binaries, live in the assemblage, break things apart, and no matter what, join us for the after party. Just stay on the line. Please unmute and give a round of applause and a series of bravos, bravas, and bravis to Matt Fournier and Abraham Weil for their discussion on transversality and feminism. Thank you so much. And I'm going to pop it over to my wonderful colleague, Rachel Wagner now.
Well, that was absolutely delightful. Thank you so much. And we're just going to have a freewheeling conversation now. Are we going to be taking questions, or are we just going to sort of talk freely, Patty?
I think what we're going to do is talk freely so that we can hear from participants. People had their hands up. And I'd like to ask people to be interactive, and that means being short. But before we start, I'd like to ask everyone to turn